This will be the first in a series of videos covering the stages of awakening and realization in the context of the 10 Oxherding pictures. The 10 Oxherding pictures are a series of woodblocks that are hundreds of years old that represent the stages of realization from the standpoint of a man trying to catch and tame an ox. The ox in this series of woodblocks and short stanzas represents your true nature. It represents the eternal principle or unfiltered reality. Ultimately, it represents enlightenment as the natural state. There are many ways to interpret the 10 Oxherding pictures, and you can find different analyses by different people as to what they mean, what stages they represent, etc. I'm just going to give one possible interpretation. As with anything about stages of realization, be mindful not to mistake the map for the territory. These are just pointers. They're not set in stone. I'm not suggesting that this is the only way to think about realization, to approach realization, or that this is the only interpretation of the stages of realization. As far as the map and territory, I recommend a few percent of your time and practice and effort on maps at most, and 95 or more percent on practice. Practice meaning meditation, inquiry, meta practices, movement practices, emotion work, shadow work, and interacting with those who have walked this path before you, who can authentically point to your true nature. I will caution you that for some people, the preoccupation with maps and descriptions of awakening and realization can be quite detrimental to this path. If you find yourself spending most of your time reading about, analyzing, and discussing the philosophy, the principles, the dogma of spirituality, rather than practicing, I would caution you to hold this very lightly. With that said, the Oxherding pictures provide a series of short stanzas with wonderful pointers to various aspects of the awakening process. So we'll start with the first Oxherding picture, titled The Search for the Ox. In the pasture of this world, I endlessly push aside tall grasses in search of the bull. Following unnamed rivers, lost upon the interpenetrating paths of distant mountains, my strength failing and my vitality exhausted, I cannot find the bull. I only hear the locusts churring through the forest at night. Comment: the bull has never been lost. What need is there to search? Only because of separation from my true nature, I fail to find him. In the confusion of the senses, I lose even his tracks. Far from home, I see many crossroads, but which way is the right one, I know not. Greed and fear, good and bad, entangle me. This first step on the path to realization is a recognition of suffering. It is a recognition of personal suffering. That may not seem like a stage towards equanimity, peace, non-duality, but it's critical that we start with authenticity. If you look at your life and say, I don't suffer, I have a great life, I have no problems, life offers me everything I could ever want, then the recognition of suffering hasn't started to crystallize in your experience yet. For me, when I was suffering a lot, if you had asked me, I probably would have said I wasn't. But it's not because I wasn't suffering, it's because the division was so strong inside me that I distanced myself even from my own suffering. I lived in a world of distance, of numbness. I would have given the answer that I thought would keep that nucleus of suffering, pain, self-doubt hidden from others. So I would have given an answer like, my life is fine, or I'm doing okay, without even considering the possibility of revealing that core of pain to anyone who was asking, even myself. So I think to even come upon the possibility of awakening and realization, sometimes we just need to be exposed to this message a few times. And at one point it clicks. It's as if we've been afraid to admit our own suffering because it's so terrifying to think that there's actually no way out of it. And when we get a taste that's real and clear enough, that actually gives us some hope that there might actually be a way to live life that is not so wrought with suffering, pain, and division, that we actually consider there might be a more authentic, integrated, enjoyable, and satisfying way to live. And that little glimmer reorients us to a certain sincerity and authenticity, and we're able to admit to ourselves that we're actually suffering. This is the first step, and this is the first stage represented by this Oxherding picture. The description of searching and being lost in this transitions nicely from the endless seeking and searching for surrogates for happiness to the reorientation of our searching for our own true nature. There's still a lot of division in this type of searching, this seeking enlightenment, seeking awakening, as if it's going to be found somewhere else, somewhere in the future. But it's a clear orientation to a deeper truth. Instead of searching for those things that we are convinced will make us happy, but never really do, to recognizing that there is something more real here going on, and we're willing to reorient to that, even though the only way we know how to orient to it in the initial movements of realization is through seeking. So seeking is okay. It's the way this starts out. But we're now orienting to something more real, more authentic, and sincerely important to us than position, money, success, security, validation, etc. The lines far from home and seeing many crossroads, being entangled by greed and fear, are very descriptive of the seeking mind that feels like it's never at home, never settled, never satisfied. This angst, this recognition of despair and inability to rest, and the exhaustion that comes along with it, is really the fire that's lit under us when we finally acknowledge our own suffering. This fire that starts to move us toward some sort of practice, whether it's meditative practice, contemplation, self-inquiry, or engaging someone or something that points to this possibility of awakening, of realization. So the suffering is necessary, even though the suffering seems like the reason we have to wake up. It's really a personal experience of the fundamental mistake of duality, of separation, that keeps the greed, ignorance, and delusion going in our minds and hearts. So while this first step might seem a bit depressing, this first stage, it's critical to come into this authenticity, to recognize that we suffer, so that this process will get underway in earnest.